Chapter 1. Introduction. Now there are times when a whole generation is caught between two ages, two modes of life, with the consequence that it loses all power to understand itself and has no standards, no security, no simple acquiescence. Hermann Hesse, Steppenwolf. 1. Centrality of the problem of anxiety in our day. Every alert citizen of our society realizes, on the basis of his own experience as well as his observation of his fellow men, that anxiety is a pervasive and profound phenomenon in the middle of the 20th century. The alert citizen, we may assume, would be aware not only of the more obvious anxiety-creating situations in our day, such as the threats of war, of the uncontrolled atom bomb, and of radical political and economic upheaval, but also of the less obvious, deeper, and more personal sources of anxiety in himself as well as in his fellow men. Namely, the inner confusion, psychological disorientation, and uncertainty with respect to values and acceptable standards of conduct. Hence, to endeavor to prove the pervasiveness of anxiety in our day is as unnecessary as the proverbial carrying of coals to Newcastle. Since the implicit sources of anxiety in our society are generally recognized, our task in this introductory chapter is somewhat more specific. We shall point out how anxiety has emerged, and has to some slight extent been defined, as an explicit problem in many different areas in our culture. It is as though in the present decade the explorations and investigations in such diverse fields as poetry and science, or religion and politics, were converging on this central problem, anxiety, whereas the period of 2 decades ago might have been termed. 3. For the meaning of anxiety. The age of covert anxiety. As we hope to demonstrate later in this chapter, the present phase of our century may well be called, as Auden and Camus call it, the age of overt anxiety. This emergence of anxiety from an implicit to an explicit problem in our society, this change from anxiety as a matter of mood to a recognition that it is an urgent issue which we must at all costs try to define and clarify, are, in the judgment of the present writer, the significant phenomena at the moment, not only in the understanding and treatment of emotional disturbances and behavioral disorders has anxiety become recognized as the nodal problem, in Freud's words, but it is now seen likewise to be nodal in such different areas as literature, sociology, political and economic thought, education, religion, and philosophy. We shall cite examples of testimony from these fields, beginning with the more general and proceeding to the more specific concern with anxiety as a scientific problem. In literature. If one were to inquire into anxiety as exhibit in the American literature, say, of 1920 or 1930, one would be forced in all probability to occupy oneself with symptoms of anxiety rather than overt anxiety itself. But though signs of open, manifest anxiety were not plentiful in that period, certainly the student could find plenty of symptomatic indications of underlying anxiety. Vide, for example, the pronounced sense of loneliness, the quality of persistent searching, frantic ally and compulsively pursued but always frustrated, in the writings of a novelist like Thomas Wolfe. 1. 1c especially Look Homeward Angel, New York, 1929, and You Can't Go Home Again, New York, 1934, and The Later of Time in the River, New York, 1935. It is exceedingly interesting that the central psychological theme of Wolfe's writings, the relation of the individual to his mother and the conflicts stemming from that relationship, is one of the central problems in any discussion of the origins of anxiety, and is in fact discussed at some length in following chapters of the present study. In the cases demonstrating anxiety in Part 2 below, it will be observed that anxiety frequently, and in many cases basically, hinged on the issue symbolically expressed in Wolfe's title, You Can't Go Home Again. We shall observe in these cases that neurotic anxiety occurred because these patients were unable to accept the psychological meaning of not going home again, namely psychological autonomy. One could wonder, realizing that literary artists symbol ically express, often with remarkable fidelity, the unconscious assumptions and conflicts of their culture, Whether these symbols in Woolf's writing could be taken to mean that many people in the late 1920s and early 1930s were beginning to realize that one cannot go home again, e.g., that it was impossible to depend for. Introduction 5. In 1950, however, our inquiry is simpler because anxiety has now emerged into overt statement in contemporaneous literature. W. H. Auden has entitled his latest poem with the phrase which he believes most accurately characterizes our period, namely, the age of anxiety. Though Auden's profound interpretation of the inner experience of the four persons in this poem is set in the time of war, when necessity is associated with horror and freedom with boredom. 3. He makes it very clear that the underlying causes of the anxiety of his characters, as well as of others of this age, must be sought on deeper levels than merely the occasion of war. The four characters in the poem, though different in temperament and in background, have in common certain characteristics of our times: loneliness, the feeling of not being of value as persons, and the experience of not being able to love and be loved, despite the common need, the common effort, and the common but temporary respite provided by alcohol. The sources of the anxiety are to be found in certain basic trends in our culture, one of which, for Auden, is the pressure toward conformity which occurs in a world where commercial and mechanical values are apatheicized. We move on as the wheel wills. One revolution registers all things, the rise and fall in pay and prices. For this stupid world where gadgets are gods and we go on talking, many about much, but remain alone, alive but alone, belonging where? Unattached as tumbleweed. 5. Security on past economic, social, and ethical criteria, and that the upshot of this realization would be the increasing emergence of overt anxiety as a conscious problem, along with a feeling of homelessness. This conjecture is, to be sure, an oversimplification, but if we take it as speculation about the central symbols of the home and the mother, it may usefully raise a problem that we shall be confronting, in much more specific form, time and again in the study of anxiety. 2. W. H. Auden, The Age of Anxiety, New York, 1947. Ibid. Page 3. Ibid. Page 45. Ibid. Page 44. 6. The meaning of anxiety. And the possibility facing these persons is that they too may be drawn into the mechanical routine of meaninglessness. The fears we know are of not knowing. Will nightfall bring us some awful order? Keep a hardware store in a small town? Teach science for life to progressive girls? It is getting late. Shall we ever be asked for? Are we simply not wanted at all? 6. What has been lost is the capacity to experience and have faith in oneself as a worthy and unique being, and at the same time the capacity for faith in and meaningful communication with other selves, namely one's fellow men. 7. The French author Albert Camus, in a phrase parallel to Auden's, designates this age as the century of fear, in comparison with the 17th century as the age of mathematics, the 18th as the age of the physical sciences, and the 19th as that of biology. Camus realizes that these characterizations are not logically parallel, that fief is not a science, but science must be somewhat involved, since its latest theoretical advances have brought it to the point of negating itself while its perfected technology threatens the globe itself with destruction. Moreover, although fear itself cannot be considered a science, it is certainly a technique. 8. Another writer who graphically expresses the anxiety and anxiety-like states of people in our period is Franz Kafka. The remarkable surge of interest in the 1940s in the writings of Kafka is important for our purposes here because of what it shows in the changing temper of our time. The fact that increasing numbers of people are finding that Kafka speaks significantly to them must indicate that he is expressing some profound aspects. Ibid. Page 42. 7. The present writer was excited to discover, during the preparation of this manuscript, that Leonard Bernstein has composed a symphony, which had its premiere in 1949, entitled Age of Anxiety. On the basis of his conviction that Auden's poem truly presents the state of our age in general, as well as speaking for the particular individual members of that age like himself, Bernstein has translated the poem into the symbols of instrumental music. 3. Quoted in the New York Times, December 21, 1947, Sector 7, page 2. Introduction 7. Of the prevailing experience of many members of our society. In Kafka's novel The Castle, the chief character devotes his life to a frantic and desperate endeavor to communicate with the authorities in the castle who control all aspects of the life of the village, and who have the power to tell him his vocation and give some meaning to his life. Kafka's hero is driven by a need for the most primitive requisites of life, the need to be rooted in a home and a calling, and to become a member of a community. 10. But the authorities in the castle remain inscrutable and inaccessible, and Kafka's character is as a result without direction and unity in his own life and remains isolated from his fellows. What the castle specifically symbolizes could be debated at length, but since the authorities in the castle are represented as the epitome of a bureaucratic efficiency which exercises such power that it quenches both individual autonomy and meaningful interpersonal relations, it may confidently be assumed that Kafka is in general writing of those aspects of his bourgeois culture of the late 19th and early 20th centuries which so elevate technical efficiency that personal values were largely destroyed. Hermann Hesse, writing less in literary symbols than Kafka, is more explicit about the sources of modern man's anxiety. He presents the story of Haller, his chief character in the novel Steppenwolf, as a parable of our period. 11. Hesse holds that Haller's and his contemporaries' isolation and anxiety arise from the fact that the bourgeois culture in the late 19th and early 20th centuries emphasized mechanical, rationalistic balance at the price of the suppression of the dynamic, irrational elements in experience. Haller tries to overcome his isolation and loneliness by giving free rein to his previously suppressed sensuous and irrational urges, the wolf, but this reactive method yields only a temporary relief. Indeed, Hesse. 9. Franz Kafka, The Castle, New York, 1930. 10. Max Brod, in appendix to Kafka's The Castle, page 329. 11. Hermann Hesse, Steppenwolf, trans. Basil Creighton, New York, 1947. Originally published in German in 1927. The awareness of traumatic social change in the 20th century occurred in Europe before it did in America. Thus, what Hesse wrote is much more relevant to conscious problems in this country in the 1940s than in 1927. Belatedly, Hesse received the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1946. 8. The meaning of anxiety presents no thoroughgoing solution to the problem of the anxiety of contemporaneous Western man, for he believes the present period to be one of those times when a whole generation is caught between two ages. That is to say, bourgeois standards and controls have broken down, but there are as yet no social standards to take their place. Hesse sees Haller's record as a document of the times, for Haller's sickness of the soul, as I now know, is not the eccentricity of a single individual, but the sickness of the times themselves, the neurosis of that generation to which Haller belongs, a sickness which attacks precisely those who are strongest in spirit and richest in gifts. 12. In sociological studies, the emergence of awareness of anxiety as an overt sociological problem in an American community during the third and fourth decades of our century is seen when we compare the Linz 2 studies of Middletown. 13. In the first study, made in the 1920s, anxiety is not an overt problem to the people of Middletown, and the topic does not appear in the Linz volume in any of its explicit forms. But anyone reading this study from a psychological viewpoint would suspect that much of the behavior of the citizens of Middletown was symptomatic of covert anxiety. For example, the compulsive work, businessmen and workingmen seem to be running for dear life in the endeavor to make money. 14. The pervasive struggle to conform, the compulsive gregariousness, the great emphasis on joining clubs, and the frantic endeavors of the people in the community to keep their leisure time crammed with activity, such as motoring. However purposeless this activity might be in itself. 15. But only one citizen, whom the Linz describe as a perspicacious observer, looked below these symptoms and sensed the presence of covert apprehension. 12. Ibid. Page 28. 13. R. S. Lind and H. M. Lind, Middletown, New York, 1929, and Middletown in Transition, New York, 1937. 14. Middletown, page 87. 1:05 on a Sunday afternoon, the regular practice of many people was to get in their ears, drive 50 miles, and then drive back again. One is reminded of Pascal's description of some symptoms of covert anxiety, the constant endeavor of people to divert themselves, to escape ennui, to avoid being alone, until agitation becomes an end in itself. See next chapter. Introduction 9. Of his fellow townsmen he observed, "These people are all afraid of something. What is it?" 16. But the later study of the same community made in the 1930s presents a very different picture. Overt anxiety is now present. One thing everybody in Middletown has in common, the Linds observe, is insecurity in the face of a complicated world. 17. To be sure, the immediate outward occasion of anxiety was the economic depression, but it would be an error to conclude that the inclusive cause of the emerging anxiety was economic insecurity. The Linds accurately relate this insecurity in Middletown to the confusion of role which the individual was then experiencing. The citizen of Middletown, they write, is caught in a chaos of conflicting patterns, none of them wholly condemned, but no one of them clearly approved and free from confusion, or where the group sanctions are clear and demanding. A certain role of a man or woman, the individual encounters cultural requirements with no immediate means of meeting them. 18. This chaos of conflicting patterns in Middletown is one expression of the pervasive social changes occurring in our culture, which the present writer will show in a later chapter to be intimately connected with the widespread anxiety of our times. 19. The Linds observe that, since most people are incapable of tolerating change and uncertainty in all sectors of life at once, 20. The tendency in Middletown was toward a retrenchment into more rigid and conservative economic and social ideologies. This ominous development as a symptom of and defense against anxiety points toward the discussion of the relation between anxiety and political authoritarianism in the next section. In the political scene. Turning to the political scene, we again find pronounced anxiety evidenced both in symptomatic and in overt forms. Without going into the complex determinants of fascism, we wish to note that it is born and gains its 16 op. Cit. Page 493. 17 Middletown in Transition, page 315. 18 Ibid, page 177. 19 This problem is discussed in some detail in Chapter 5, where we endeavor to demonstrate the relation between cultural change and anxiety. 20/Cit. page 315. The meaning of anxiety. Power in periods of widespread anxiety. Tillich describes the situation in Europe in the 1930s, out of which German fascism developed. First of all, a feeling of fear or, more exactly, of indefinite anxiety was prevailing. Not only the economic and political, but also the cultural and religious security seemed to be lost. There was nothing on which one could build. Everything was without foundation. A catastrophic breakdown was expected every moment. Consequently, a longing for security was growing in every body. A freedom that leads to fear and anxiety has lost its value. Better authority with security than freedom with fear. 21. In such periods, people grasp at political authoritarianism in the desperate need to be relieved of anxiety. Totalitarianism in this sense may be viewed as serving a purpose on a cultural scale parallel to that in which a neurotic symptom protects an individual from a situation of unbearable anxiety. 22 With some very significant differences, communistic totalitarianism fulfills a similar function. 23 As we shall endeavor to indicate later in this study, fascism and communism are not only economic phenomena, but are also the product of the spiritual, ethical, and psychological vacuum which characterized the breakdown of the bourgeois tradition in Western Europe. 24 As Martin Eben phrases it, communism is a product of the desperate wish to find a purpose in what seems confusion and emptiness. 25 In this confusion and emptiness one thing did exist, namely anxiety. And we are submitting that totalitarianism gains its foothold to a considerable extent because, like a symptom, it binds and provides some relief from the anxiety. 26. 21 Paul Tillich, The Protestant Era, Chicago, 1947, page 245. 22 cf. Goldstein, page 57, below. Also, Herbert L. Matthews, observer of Italian and Spanish fascism, writes, "Fascism was like a jail where the individual had a certain amount of security, shelter, and daily food. The Education of a Correspondent, New York, 1946. 23 Arthur M. Schlesinger, Jr. Communism has filled the vacuum of faith caused by the waning of established religion. It provides a sense of purpose which heals internal agonies of anxiety and doubt." New York Times, February 1st, 1948. 24C. Also Eric Fromm, Escape from Freedom, New York, 1941. Discussed with respect to this point on pages 169 to 76, below. 25 World Communism Today, New York, 1948. 26 A task which awaits doing on the part of students of anxiety is the detailed study of dictatorship as an anxiety phenomenon. To some extent, it might be said, Introduction N. In addition to anxiety in the above symptomatic forms, unsystematized anxiety has been increasingly evident in the socio-political scene in the past decade. The frequent references to Roosevelt's sentence in his first inaugural, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself," testify to the fact that large number bears of people have become increasingly aware of fear, or more accurately, anxiety, in the face of the radical socio-political changes in our day. The emergence of the atom bomb brought the previously inchoate and free-floating anxiety of many people into sharp focus. The stark possibilities of modern man's situation are stated in an impassioned expression of the crystallization of anxiety at that moment by Norman Cousins. The beginning of the atomic age has brought less hope than fear. It is a primitive fear, the fear of the unknown, the fear of forces man can neither channel nor comprehend. This fear is not new. In its classical form, it is the fear of irrational death. But overnight, it has become intensified, magnified. It has burst out of the subconscious into the conscious, filling the mind with primordial apprehensions. Where man can find no answer, he will find fear. 27. Even if we should escape being confronted with actual death in a shooting and atomic war, the anxiety inhering in our portentous world situation would still be with us. The historian Arnold Toynbee has stated his belief that overt warfare on a world scale is not probable in our lifetime, but that we shall remain in a cold war for a generation, which will mean a perpetual condition of tension and worry. To live in a state of anxiety for a generation is, indeed, a horrendous prospect. But the picture is not inevitably black. Toynbee holds that the tension in the persistent Cold War can be used constructively as dictatorships are born and come to power in periods of cultural anxiety. Once in power, they live in anxiety, e.g., many of the acts of the dictating group are motivated by its own anxiety, and the dictatorship perpetuates its power by capitalizing upon and engendering anxiety in its own people as well as in its rival nations. Just how completely, however, such statements can be made awaits a good deal of investigation. The present writer, for one, believes such a study would be very fruitful. 27 Modern Man is Obsolete, New York, 1945, page 1. First printed as an editorial in the Saturday Review of Literature and then published in book form. 12 The Meaning of Anxiety. Our motivation for bettering our own socioeconomic standards. In the West, the present writer agrees with Toynbee that our political and social survival depends both on our capacity for tolerating the anxiety inherent in the threatening world situation, and thus not irrationally precipitating war as a way out of the painful uncertainty, and also on our capacity for turning this anxiety to constructive uses. 28. In philosophy and religion. The fact that anxiety has emerged as a central problem in contemporaneous philosophy and religion is not only a general but also a specific indication of the prevalence of anxiety in our culture. It is a specific indica. Tie-in in the respect that anxiety has become most prominent in the thought of those theologians like R. Niebuhr who are most intimately concerned with the economic and political issues of our day, and in those philosophers like Tillich and M. Heidegger, who have experienced in their own lives the cultural crises and upheavals of Western society in the past 3 decades. Point 29. Tillich describes anxiety as man's reaction to the threat of non-being. Man is the creature who has self-conscious awareness of his being, but he is also aware that at any moment he might cease to exist. Point 30. Thus, in philosophical terms, anxiety. 28. Arnold Toynbee, How to Turn the Tables on Russia, Woman's Home Companion, August 1949. 30. F. Toynbee gives an analogy which is such a vivid parable of the constructive uses of anxiety that we summarize it here. The fishermen bringing in their herring from the North Sea were faced with the problem of the fish becoming sluggish in their tanks and thus losing some of their market value for freshness. Then one fisherman conceived the idea of placing a couple of catfish in the herring tanks. Because of the threat of death in the presence of these catfish, the herring not only did not grow sluggish but became even more active and flourishing. Of course, whether the reaction of the Western world to the catfish, Russia, will be constructive or not is another question. In other words, whether we shall use the anxiety in our world situation predominantly for constructive purposes remains largely to be seen. There are some momentously constructive signs, e.g., the Marshall Plan. Psychologically, this experiment has, in the present writer's opinion, the expansive, cooperative, courageous characteristics of a typically constructive approach to anxiety. But on the other hand, there are the ominous tendencies in the spy scares, witch hunts, etc., which, again speaking in psychological analogy, look very much like the retrenchments and phobic withdrawals which classically characterize the neurotic approach to anxiety. 29. In the light of Nietzsche's idea that the philosopher is a physician of culture, the thought of these writers is to be regarded not as the product of ivory tower speculation, but as a diagnosis and articulation of one phase of the condition of our culture. So this concept of Tillich's was of course formulated before the emergence of the atom bomb, but the bomb is undoubtedly a symbol by which many more people are able to comprehend the immediate threat of non-being. Introduction. 13. Arises as the individual is aware of being as over against the ever-present possibility of non-being. Point 31. Non-being does not mean simply the threat of physical death, though probably death is the most common form and symbol of this anxiety. The threat of non-being lies in the psychological and spiritual realms as well, namely the threat of meaninglessness in one's existence. 32. Generally, the threat of meaninglessness is experienced negatively as a threat to the existence of the self, the experience of the dissolution of the self in Goldstein's term. But when this form of anxiety is confronted affirmatively, when the individual both realizes the threat of meaninglessness and takes a stand against the threat, the result is a strengthening of the individual's feel-ing of being a self, a strengthening of his perception of himself as distinct from the world of non-being of objects. Niebuhr makes anxiety the central concept of his theological doctrine of man. To Niebuhr, every act of man, creative or destructive, involves some element of anxiety. Anxiety has its source in the fact that man is on one hand finite, involved like the animals in the contingencies and necessities of nature, but on the other hand man has freedom. Unlike the animals, he sees this situation of contingency and anticipates its perils, and to this extent man transcends his finiteness. In short, man, being both bound and free, both limited and limitless, is anxious. Anxiety is the inevitable concomitant of the paradox of freedom and finiteness in which man is involved. 33. Much will be said later in the present study about anxiety as the precondition of neurosis. It is significant that Niebuhr, in parallel theological terms, makes anxiety the internal precondition of sin. Anxiety is the internal description of the state of temptation. 34. In psychology, anxiety is the most prominent mental characteristic of Occidental civilization, R. Willoughby asserts. He then presents statistical evidence for this assertion. 3. I. C. F. Kierkegaard's description of anxiety as the of nothingness. 32 references to Tillich's explanation of the causes of the prevalence of meaninglessness in our culture will be made in later sections. See chapters 2 and 5. 33 Reinhold Niebuhr, The Nature and Destiny of Man, New York, 1941. Page 182. 34 Ibid. I. For the meaning of anxiety. In the form of the rising incidences in 3 fields of social pathology which he believes may reasonably be understood as reactions to anxiety, namely suicide, the junctional forms of mental disorder, and divorce. 35 suicide rates for the last 75 to 100 years show a steady increase in the majority of the countries of continental Europe. With regard to the functional forms of mental illness, Willoughby holds, it seems probable that there is a real rise in incidence of mental disease even when the greatest reasonable allowance is made for increasing facilities for hospitalization and insight in diagnosis. 36 The divorce rates for every country except Japan have shown a steady upward trend in the 20th century. Willoughby believes the incidence of divorce is a measure of the inability of the members of the culture to tolerate the additional stress of the critical marital adjustment, and the higher incidence must presuppose a considerable load of anxiety in the culture. 37. We would not question Willoughby's purpose in introducing these statistics, namely, to substantiate the common-sense proposition that there is in our civilization a large and increasing incidence of anxiety. But there might rightly be considerable question as to whether the relation between these statistical evidences and anxiety is as direct as he holds. Suicide can be due to other motivations than anxiety. Revenge is one example. And the rising incidence of divorce would seem to be due to changing social attitudes toward divorce as well as to the previous ailments of anxiety. But certainly the 3 groups of statistics Willoughby presents indicate radical social upheavals in our society which involve psychological and emotional trauma. To the present writer, it seems more logical to regard rising divorce, suicide, and mental disease rates as symptoms and products of the dramatically changing state of our culture, and to regard anxiety also as a symptom and product of that cultural state. 35 R. Willoughby, Magic and Cognate Phenomena. An Hypothesis in Carl Murchison edition, Handbook of Social Psychology, Worcester, Massachusetts, 1935, page 498. Sibid. Page 500. 37 An important fact in America is that divorces for cruelty are solely responsible for the increase, all other causes steadily declining. Willoughby interprets cruelty as a matter of increase of anxiety. If the conduct of the spouse is such as to exacerbate anxiety, it is cruel. Op. Cit. Introduction 15. And certainly a culture described by these statistics would be a culture which generates much anxiety. Since in subsequent chapters we are concerned in detail with the study of anxiety in the various fields of psychology, we shall here only cite, in line with our introductory purpose, that anxiety has gradually come to be seen as a central problem in learning theory, in dynamic psychology, and specifically in psychoanalysis and other forms of psychotherapy. While it long has been recognized that apprehensions and fears, particularly those related to approval or punishment from parents and teachers, exerted much power over the child in school, not until recently have there been scientific recognitions of the innumerable subtle expressions and influences of anxiety permeating the child's educational and classroom experience. For this appreciation of anxiety as a focal problem in learning theory and the scientific formulation thereof, we are indebted to such learning psychologists as Maurer, Miller, and Dollard. 38 More than 3 decades ago, Freud singled out anxiety as the crucial problem of emotional and behavioral disorders. Further development of psychoanalysis has only substantiated his proposition, until it is now recognized on all sides that anxiety is the fundamental phenomenon of neurosis, or in Horney's term, the dynamic center of neuroses. But not only in psychopathology. In the actions of normal people as well as abnormal, it is now recognized that anxiety is much more prevalent than was suspected several decades ago. From the viewpoint of dynamic psychology, Simons accurately notes that it would surprise most persons to realize how much of their behavior is motivated by a desire to escape anxiety by either reducing it or disguising it in one way or another. 39. Whether we are concerned with normal or pathological behavior, Freud was correct in saying that the solution to the riddle of anxiety must cast a flood of light upon our whole mental life. 40. 38. Discussed in Chapter 4. 39. P. M. Simons, The Dynamics of Human Adjustment, New York, 1946, page 138. 40. Sigmund Freud, General Introduction to Psychoanalysis, American edition, New York, 1920, page 341. 6. The meaning of anxiety. 2. Purpose of this study. Despite the fact that anxiety has become a central problem in so many diverse areas in our culture, the attack on the problem has been handicapped by the fact that the various theories and studies of anxiety have, to date, been uncoordinated. Freud's description of the state of the problem in the opening paragraph of his chapter on anxiety published in 1933 is still largely accurate. You will not be surprised to hear that I have a great deal of new information to give you about our hypotheses on the subject of anxiety, and also that none of this information claims to provide a final solution of these doubtful problems. What is necessary at the present stage of the understanding of anxiety is the introduction of the right abstract ideas, and of their application to the raw material of observation so as to bring order and lucidity into it. 41. The purpose of the present study is to bring, so far as we are able, some order and lucidity into the presently uncoordinated field of anxiety theory. We propose to bring together the various theories of anxiety and to view them in their cultural and historical as well as their biological and psychological dimensions. We shall then seek the basic common denominators in these theories, assess the points of disagreement, and, so far as possible, synthesize the various viewpoints into a comprehensive theory of anxiety. The case studies in Part 2 of this book are presented for the purpose of testing anxiety theory clinically. That is, for illustrating and demonstrating or questioning various aspects of a comprehensive, contemporary theory of anxiety. 41. Sigmund Freud, New Introductory Lectures in Psychoanalysis, New York, 1933, page 113. Chapter 2. Philosophical Predecessors to Modern Theories of Anxiety. I have no desire to speak in strong terms about this age as a whole, but he who has observed the contemporary generation will surely not deny that the incongruity in it and the reason for its anxiety and restlessness is this, that in one direction truth increases in extent, in mass, partly also in abstract clarity, whereas certitude steadily decreases. Spren Kierkegaard, The Concept of Dread. Until the advent of Freud and the other depth psychologists, the problem of anxiety lay in the provinces of philosophy, especially in its branch of ethics and religion. The particular philosophers who dealt most explicitly with anxiety and fear were those whose primary concern was not with the formation of abstract intellectual systems, but rather with the existential conflicts and crises of immediate human beings. It is thus no historical accident that the most penetrating insights into anxiety and its related problems should have come from those thinkers whose interests were both religious and philosophical, such as Pascal, Spinoza, and Kierkegaard. An inquiry into the philosophical backgrounds of the problem of anxiety is of help in understanding contemporaneous anxiety in two respects. The first and most obvious help is in the actual insights into the meaning of anxiety to be found in the writings of some philosophers, insights which, as seen in Kierkegaard, not only often antedate Freud's theories but in some respects predict developments after Freud. Second, such an inquiry illuminates one phase of the historical background of the problem of anxiety in our society. Thus our investigation in since an individual's anxiety is conditioned by the fact that he stands at a particular point in the historical development of his culture, an understanding of 18. The meaning of anxiety. This chapter should cast light on the genesis of certain cultural issues and attitudes which are crucial for much contemporaneous anxiety. One such issue, for example, is the dichotomy between mind and body, which was enunciated in its dominant modern form by Descartes and other thinkers of the 17th century, and which not only produced psychological disunity and anxiety for large numbers of people in the late 19th and 20th centuries, but in some respects specifically set the problem of anxiety for Freud. 2. Another such issue is the tendency of our culture to be preoccupied with rational, mechanical phenomena and to suppress so-called irrational experience. We may approach this issue by means of 2 questions. Why did anxiety not emerge as a specific problem until the middle of the 19th century? And why was anxiety not dealt with as a problem in the various schools of psychology, excepting psychoanalysis, until the latter 1930s, despite the fact that during the last half-century the study of fears has been prominent in psychology? Among the varied legitimate answers to these questions, one important factor is our widespread tendency since the Renaissance to avoid and look askance at irrational phenomena, and to admit in our own experience as well as to accept as a legitimate area for investigation only those aspects of experience which can be made to appear rational. That is, aspects of experience for which intellectual reasons can be presented. Since fears are experienced as specific and definite, we can present logical reasons for them, and we can study them by mathematical means. But anxiety is generally experienced by an individual as a profoundly irrational phenomenon. The tendency to suppress anxiety because it seems irrational or to rationalize it in terms of fears is by no means limited to sophisticated intellectuals in our culture. A continu ally crops up in clinical or psychoanalytic work as a major hurdle. In therapy with anxiety problems, point 3 for understanding the development of his culture is indispensable to understanding the individual's anxiety. This assumption, which is implicit in the present chapter, is dealt with in some detail in Chapter 5. 2 cf. Rollo May, Historical Roots of Modern Anxiety Theories, paper delivered at Symposium on Anxiety of America Psychopath. S. June 3, 1949, to be published. 3. For example, this tendency appeared in several of the cases in the study of philosophical predecessors. 19. Genesis of such cultural tendencies, an inquiry into the background of the accepted attitudes and normative ideas of our society is necessary. For we begin with the 17th century because in that century the systems of thought which have been dominant for the major part of the modern period were formulated. Point 5. The philosophies of the 17th century had one theme in common with respect to the understanding of human nature. They presented the rationalistic solution to the problem of man. 6. The common denominator was the confidence that each man was a rational individual who could arrive at autonomy in his intellectual, social, religious, and emotional life. Mathematics was conceived as the chief tool of reason. This belief in autonomous reason, as Tillich calls it, or mathematical reason, in Cassirer's phrase, was the guiding intellectual principle of the Cultural Revolution which, beginning in the Renaissance, resulted in the overthrow of feudalism and absolutism and ultimately led to the supremacy of the bourgeoisie. It was believed that autonomous reason would make possible the control of the individual's emotions, e.g., Spinoza. Autonomous reason would also make possible the mastery of physical nature. Anxiety in unmarried mothers presented in Chapter 7. See especially the case of Helen, Case 4, who had strong anxiety arising from her extramarital pregnancy, but who sought to repress this anxiety beneath a continual concern for the quasi-scientific facts of pregnancy. Helen's need to exclude from conscious awareness all ideas and feelings which were not intellectually acceptable and explicable is, it probably would be generally admitted, typical of many persons in our society. For in the discussion which follows, we do not treat philosophical formulations as either cause or effect, but rather as one expression of the total cultural development of the period. The particular philosophers whose formulations have become important for their own and subsequent centuries, such as those we shall refer to in this chapter, are those who were successful in penetrating and expressing the dominant meaning and direction of development of their culture. It is in this sense that the formulations made by the intellectual leaders of one century become the common currency in the form of unconscious assumptions of large numbers of people in succeeding centuries. Other aspects of the development of modern culture as it affects the problem of anxiety, e.g., the economic and sociological aspects, are referred to in Chapter 5. A summary of the cultural backgrounds of contemporaneous anxiety is given in Chapter 6 and may serve as a supplement to the discussion in this chapter. 5. Many of the formative principles which guided the scientists and philosophers of that century had emerged in the Renaissance, but it was in the 17th century, that remarkable classical period of Descartes, Spinoza, Pascal, Leibniz, Locke, Hobbes, Galileo, Newton, that they received their systematic formulation. 6. Ernst Cassirer, An Essay on Man, New Haven, Connecticut, 1944, page 16. 20. The meaning of anxiety. A confidence which was later to be thoroughly substantiated by far-reaching progress in the physical sciences. Descartes gave impetus to this development by his sharp distinction between mind and the processes of thought on one hand and physical nature, extension, on the other. The crucial point was in a corollary to Descartes' dichotomy, namely that physical nature, including the body, could be understood and controlled by means of mechanical, mathematical laws. 7. The way was thus paved for the preoccupation in modern times with phenomena which were susceptible to mechanical and mathematical treatment, a preoccupation which was to be accompanied both by an endeavor to extend the application of the methods of mechanics and mathematics to as many areas of experience as possible, and by a tendency to omit from consideration those aspects of experience which were not susceptible to such methods of treatment. 8. The confidence that physical nature and the human body were mathematically and mechanically controllable had vast anxiety-dispelling effects. This was not only true in the respect of meet man's material needs and overcoming the actual threats of physical nature, but also in the respect of freeing man from irrational fears and anxiety. A way was opened for dissolving the multitude of fears of devils, sorcerers, and forms of magic which had been the foci of pervasive anxiety in the last 2 centuries of the Middle Ages as well as in the Renaissance. 9. Tillich points out that the Cartesians, by means of their assumption that the soul could not influence the body, were able to disenchant the world. For one example, the persecution of witches, which had occurred through the Renaissance to the early 18th century, was overcome through Cartesian formulations. 7. Descartes' endeavor was to explain all of the world except God and the soul by mechanical and mathematical laws. Will Durant, The Story of Philosophy, New York, 1926, page 167. 8. The suppression of the non-mechanical and irrational aspects of experience went hand in hand, both as cause and effect, with the needs of the new industrialism following the Renaissance. What could be calculated and measured had practical utility in the industrial workaday world, and what was irrational did not. Tillich. 9. Cf. Johann Huizinga and Karl Mannheim in Chapter 5 below. Philosophical predecessors. 21. The confidence in the power of the autonomous rational individual which had emerged at the Renaissance and was more explicitly formulated in the 17th century, thus had on one side its anxiety-dispelling effects. 10. But on the other side, since the confidence in reason was inseparably connected with the individualism of the Renaissance, it brought in its train new sources of anxiety in feelings of psychological isolation on the part of the individual. 11. This problem was confronted in the thought of the 17th century, and the solution presented had far-reaching effects in allaying anxiety. This solution consists of the belief that the liberation of reason in every person would lead to a realization of a universal humanity and to a system of harmony between individuals and society. That is to say, the individual need not feel isolated, for if he courageously pursued his own reason, his conclusions and his interests would ultimately be in accord with those of his fellow men, and a harmonious community would be achieved. Moreover, a physical basis for overcoming isolation was presented, namely, that the pursuit of universal reason would lead the individual into accord with universal reality. 12. As Cassirer puts it, 10. In some ways, in fact, the doctrine of autonomous reason was in itself an intellectual expression in the 17th century of Renaissance individualism. It seems to the present writer that Descartes' classical phrase, "I think, therefore I exist," shows the emphasis on rational processes as a criterion of existence and also implies that one arrives at belief in his own existence in vacuo as far as the community is concerned. Compare the present psychological concept that the experience of identity of the self occurs when the child becomes aware of other people as distinct from himself. W. H. Auden phrases this social origin of the self in succinct poetic terms. For the ego is a dream till a neighbor's need by name create it. The Age of Anxiety, New York, 1947, page 8. 11. This point is discussed in Chapter 5. 12. Both the individualistic character of the thought of this period and the factors compensating for it can be seen in Leibniz. His basic doctrine of the monads is individualistic in the sense that the monads are unitary, separated. But the compensating element is given in his doctrine of pre-established harmony. Tillich expresses this graphically. In the system of harmony, the metaphysical solitude of every individual is strongly emphasized by the doctrine that there are no doors and windows from one monad to the other one. Every single unit is lonely in itself, without any direct communication. The horror of this idea was overcome by the harmonistic presupposition that in every monad the whole world is potentially present, and that the development of each individual is in a natural harmony with the development of all the others. This is the most profound metaphysical symbol for the situation in the early periods of bourgeois civilization. Fitted. 22. The meaning of anxiety. Mathematical reason was the bond between man and the universe. 13. These anxiety-dispelling factors are essential to understand why the specific problem of anxiety is so rarely confronted by the thinkers of the 17th century. We shall demonstrate in the writings of Spinoza that the confidence that fear could be overcome by reason did serve to a considerable extent to obviate the problem of anxiety. We shall also discuss Pascal, a representative of the period who could not accept the prevalent confidence in the power of autonomous reason and for whom, at the same time, anxiety was a central problem. 1. Spinoza, Reason Overcoming Fear. An eminent example of the method of dealing with fear in terms of mathematical reason is found in the writings of Baruch Spinoza. Spinoza ventures to make the last and decisive step in this mathematical theory of the world and the human mind, remarks Cassirer. Spinoza constructs a new ethics, a mathematical theory of the moral world. 14. It is well known that Spinoza's writings are replete with acute psychological insights. 15. We can be sure that, if Spinoza does not concern himself with anxiety, it is not because of lack of psychological discernment. At many points he anticipates later psychoanalytic concepts, as, for only one example, when he states that a passion, meaning an emotional complex, ceases to be a passion when one has formed a clear and distinct idea of it. 16. This situation because there was still a common world, in spite of the increasing social atomization. The Protestant Era, Chicago, 1948, page 246.
13. Cassirer, op. Zit, piano 16.
14. Ibid, page 16. His psychological insights are remarkably close to contemporary scientific psychological theories, such as his statement that mental and physical phenomena are two aspects of the same process. His definition of emotions is a predecessor of the modern James Lange theory. By emotion I understand the modifications of the body by which the power of action in the body is increased or diminished, aided or restrained, and at the same time the ideas of these modifications. Origin and nature of the emotions, Spinoza's Ethics, Everyman edition, London, 1910, page 84. Is Spinoza's Ethics the Power of the Intellect, page 203. Spinoza saw the political aspect of freedom from fear. Indeed, the purpose of the state is so to free each man from fear that he may live and act with full security and without injury to himself or his neighbor.
Durant, op. Zit, piano 211.
Philosophical Predecessors 23. Spinoza believed that fear is essentially a subjective problem, that is, a matter of one's state of mind or attitudes. He defines fear in juxtaposition to hope. They are both characteristic of the person in doubt. Fear is an uncertain pain, arising from the idea that something we hate may befall us, and hope is an uncertain pleasure, arising from the idea that a good we wish may come to pass. It follows from these definitions, he adds, that fear cannot be without hope, nor hope without fear. 17. Fear arises from a weakness of mind and therefore does not appertain to the use of reason. 18. Hope also is a weakness of mind. Therefore, the more we endeavor to live under the guidance of reason, the less we endeavor to depend on hope, and the more to deliver ourselves and make ourselves free from fear and overcome fortune as much as possible, and finally to direct our actions by the certain advice of reason. 19. Spinoza's guidance on how to overcome fear is consistent with the general rational emphasis of the time, in which emotion is not repressed but rather made amenable to reason. It is true, he holds, that an emotion can be overcome only by a contrary, stronger one. But this can be done by paying attention to the ordering of our thoughts and images. We must think of courage in the same manner in order to lay aside fear. That is, we must enumerate and imagine the common perils of life and in what manner they may best be avoided and overcome by courage. 20. At several points in his analysis, Spinoza stands on the threshold of the problem of anxiety, as, for example, when he defines fear in juxtaposition to hope. But he does not cross the threshold into the problem of anxiety itself. The simultaneous presence of fear and hope within the individual, perpetuated over a period of time, is one aspect of the psychic conflict that is seen by later writers as anxiety. 21. But Spinoza, in marked contrast, 17. Spinoza's Ethics, Origin and Nature of the Emotions, page 131, is on the basis of this statement of Spinoza's. One can contemplate with profit how greatly the historical situation in which one lives conditions one's anxiety and fear. One could say that living without fear in the 20th century, the day of atom bombs, totalitarianism, and traumatic social change, shows weakness of mind, or more accurately, insensitivity, atrophy of mind. 19. Spinoza's Ethics, The Strength of the Emotions, page 175. The Power of the Intellect, in Spinoza's Ethics, London, 1910, page 208. 21. Cf. Kurt Riesler, The Social Psychology of Fear, America J. Social. May 1944, page 489. For examples of such psychic conflicts underlying anxiety, see what we. 24. The Meaning of Anxiety. To Kierkegaard in the 19th century, does not see conflict between hope and fear as persistent or necessary. Fears can be overcome by courageous dedication to reason, and hence the problem of anxiety does not confront him. A similar difference between Spinoza and philosophers of the 19th century is evidenced in the treatment of confidence and despair. In Spinoza's terms, we are confident when the cause of doubt has been removed from our hope, i.e., we are certain the good event will occur. And we are in despair when the element of doubt is removed from our fear, i.e., when we are certain that the evil event will occur or has occurred. For Kierkegaard, in contrast, confidence is not the removal of doubt and anxiety, but rather the attitude that we can move ahead despite doubt and anxiety. In Spinoza, it is that word certain which strikes us so boldly. If one believed, as apparently Spinoza in his century could believe, that such intellectual and emotional certainty could be achieved, untold psychological security would result. This belief, of course, underlay Spinoza's constructing a mathematics of ethics. One should be as certain about an ethical problem as one is about proposition in geometry. The essential point is that for Spinoza, the removal of doubt and the attainment of certainty is possible if we direct ourselves by the certain advice of reason. The central problem of anxiety does not intrude itself into Spinoza's thought. One cannot escape the conclusion that, given the cultural situation in which he lived, his confidence in reason served him satisfactorily. Point 22. Describe as the rift between expectation and reality, which underlay the neurotic anxiety of the cases in Part 2, page 339 ff. below. 22. It is to be borne in mind not only that Spinoza's 17th century cultural situation was different from the situation of the 19th and 20th centuries, but also that his confidence in reason was different from the deteriorated forms of rationalism in the 19th century, which involved a denial and repression of emotion. Since in the above discussion we are chiefly interested in Spinoza as a spokesman for the confidence in reason in the 17th century, it is important to emphasize that he was by no means merely a rationalist in the contemporary connotation of that term. His ethical and mystical interests gave a broad and profound context to his thought which was absent in the later and more limited forms of rationalism. For example, if we should follow out to the ultimate step, his analysis of how to overcome fear and anxiety so far as anxiety appears as a problem, we should discover that each destructive effect must be overcome by a stronger, constructive one, and that he defined the ultimate constructive effect in the curiously mystico-rationalistic phrase, the intellectual love of God. In other words, fear and anxiety can be overcome in the last analysis only by a religious. Philosophical predecessors. 25. 2. Pascal, Anxiety and the Insufficiency of Reason. Though representative of the eminent intellectuals of the 17th century in his mathematical and scientific genius, Blaise Pascal was the exception in that he did not believe human nature, with all its variety, richness, and contradiction, could be comprehended by mathematical rationalism. He believed rational certitude about man was not possible in any sense similar to rational certitude in geometry and physics. The laws that operate in human life are laws of chance and probabilities. Hence, he was impressed by the contingency of human existence. When I consider the brief span of my life, swallowed up in the eternity before and behind it, the small space that I fill or even see, engulfed in the infinite immensity of spaces which I know not, and which know not me, I am afraid, and wonder to see myself here rather than there. For there is no reason why I should be here rather than there, now rather than then. Point 23. Pascal was directly concerned with anxiety, not only anxiety which he himself experienced but which he believed he observed underneath the surface of the lives of his contemporaries, evidenced by the perpetual restlessness in which men pass their lives. 24. He noted the unceasing endeavors of people to divert themselves, to escape ennui, to avoid being alone, until agitation becomes an end in itself. The great bulk of diversions, he felt, were actually endeavors of people to avoid thoughts of attitude toward one's life as a whole. C.F. Eric from Man for Himself, New York, 1947, on this point. It should also be mentioned, by the way, that one important consequence of the broad base of Spinoza's thinking was that he was able to avoid the dichotomy between mind and body which characterized other philosophies of his day. 23. Pascal's Pensées, edition and trans.
A. Rawlings MT Vernon EI 1946 A36.
Also, on beholding the blindness and misery of man, on seeing all the universe dumb, and man without light, left to himself, as it were astray in this corner of the universe, knowing not who has set him here, what he is here for, or what will become of him when he dies, incapable of all knowledge, I begin to be afraid, as a man who has been carried while asleep to a fearful desert island, and who will wake not knowing where he is and without any means of quitting the island. And thus I marvel that people are not seized with despair at such a miserable condition. Ibid. Page 7. Pascal's Thoughts, trans. Edward Craig, New York, 1825, page 110. 26. The meaning of anxiety. Themselves. For if they should pause for self-contemplation, they would be miserable and anxious. In his preoccupation with the contingent and uncertain aspects of human experience, Pascal took cognizance of the fact that reason was offered as a guide to certainty, but he believed that reason is undependable as a practical guide. It is not that he devaluated reason as such. On the contrary, he believed it to be the distinctive quality of man, the source of man's dignity in the midst of unthinking nature, and the source of morality. To think well is the principle of morality 25. But in practical life, reason is undependable because it is pliable to every sense, and sense reports are notoriously deceptive. Moreover, the usual confidence in reason is faulty, he held, because it fails to take into account the power of the emotions. 26. Pascal conceived of the emotions in both a positive and a negative sense. He saw values in the emotions that were not comprehended in rational ism. The heart has reasons which the reason knows not of. On the other hand, the emotions often distort and overrule reason, and reason becomes mere rationalization. Overconfidence in reason often facilitates the abuse of reason to support mere custom, or the power of kings or injustice. In practice, reason is often a matter of truth on this side of the Pyrenees, error on that. 27. He was impressed with the frequency with which self-interest and vanity are the actual motivations of men, and are then justified by reason. Greater trust could be placed in reason. He remarks epigrammatically, if reason were only reasonable. In all these qualifications of the prevalent confidence in reason, it is clear that Pascal valued very highly what he termed a genuine love of and respect for wisdom, but he felt that love of and respect for wisdom are rare phenomena in human life. Hence, he saw the human situation much less optimistically than his contemporaries. We are placed in a vast medium, ever floating uncertainly between ignorance and knowledge. 28. 25. Pascal's Pensées, Rawlings edition and trans. Op. Cit. Page 35. 26. It is interesting to note, in connection with Pascal's lament that the emotions were not reasonable, that it became Freud's endeavor over 3 centuries later to extend the domain of reason to include the emotions. 27. Rawlings, edition and trans. Op. Cit. Page 38. 2. Craig, trans. Op. Cit. Page 84. Philosophical Predecessors 27. We have suggested that the confidence in reason, as interpreted by the intellectual leaders of the 17th century, served to dispel anxiety. It is some support for this thesis that Pascal, the one who could not accept the rationalistic solution to human problems, was at the same time the one who could not avoid anxiety. Pascal stands as an exception, however, to the prevalent formulations of his day, and to the central stream of the philosophical developments in the modern period. 29. On the whole, the belief that through reason nature could be mastered and man's emotions ordered served the intellectual leaders of that day relatively satisfactorily, so that the problem of anxiety rarely is confronted in their thought. We suggest that the cultural position in which Spinoza and the other thinkers of this classical phase of the modern period found themselves did not result in the inner trauma which was to occur to comparable intellectual leaders in the 19th century and to vast numbers of people. In the 20th century, the central belief in the power of autonomous reason gave a psychological unity to the culture which was not to be threatened with serious disintegration until the 19th century. 3. Kierkegaard and the problem of anxiety in the 19th century. In the 19th century, we can observe on a broad scale the occurrence of fissures in the unity of modern culture which underlie much of our contemporary anxiety. The revolutionary belief in autonomous reason, which had been central in the inception and structuralization of modern culture, was now supplanted by technical reason. 30. The rapidly increasing mastery over 29. The question of why he was an exception, and why he experienced inner trauma and anxiety to a much greater degree than his contemporaries, would take us afield from this discussion. We might, however, mention Cassirer's suggestion that Pascal's view of man is really a carryover from medievalism, and that despite Pascal's scientific genius, he had not really absorbed the new view of man which had emerged at the Renaissance. So the term is Paul Tillich's. It refers to the fact that in the 19th century reason, in practice, became increasingly applied to technical problems. Cf. Nietzsche and Cassirer in next paragraph. The theoretical implications of this. 28. The meaning of anxiety. Physical nature was accompanied by widespread and profound changes in the structure of human society. The economic and sociological aspects of these changes concern us in a later section, but here it is important to note the changes at that time in man's view of himself. This was the era of autonomous sciences. 31. Each science developed in its own direction, but a unifying principle, as Cassirer phrases it, was lacking. It was against the consequences of science as a factory that Nietzsche warned. He saw technical reason progressing rapidly on one hand and the disintegration of human ideals and values on the other, and he feared the nihilism which would result. The views of man presented in the 19th century are not divorced in most cases from the empirical data produced by the advancing sciences, but since science itself was without a unifying principle, there was great variance in the interpretations of man. Each individual thinker, Cassirer remarks, gives us his own picture of human nature, and whereas each picture is based upon empirical evidence, each theory becomes a Procrustean bed on which the empirical facts are stretched to fit a preconceived pattern. 32. Cassirer feels that this antagonism of ideas constitute not only a grave theoretical problem, but an imminent threat to the whole extent of our ethical and cultural life. 33. The 19th century was marked by a cultural compartmentalization, not only in theories and in the sciences but in other phases of culture as well. In aesthetics, there was the art for art's sake movement and an increasing separation of art from the realities of nature, a development attack toward the end of the century by Cézanne and Van Gogh. In religion, there was a separation of theoretical beliefs and Sunday practices. Growing emphasis on the technical aspects of reason were not widely appreciated at the time. 3. I. Werner Brock, Contemporary German Philosophy, Cambridge, 1935. 32. An Essay on Man, Op. Cit., page 21. Cassirer continues, owing to this development our modern theory of man lost its intellectual center. We acquired instead a complete anarchy of thought. Theologians, scientists, politicians, sociologists, biologists, psychologists, ethnologists, economists all approach the problem from their own viewpoints. To combine or unify all these particular aspects and perspectives was impossible. Every author seems in the last count to be led by his own conception and evaluation of human life. 33. Ibid. Page 22. Philosophical Predecessors 29. From the Affairs of Weekday Life. The compartmentalization in family life is vividly portrayed and attacked by Ibsen in The Doll's House. With respect to the psychological life of the individual, the 19th century is broadly characterized by a separation of reason and emotions, with voluntaristic effort, will, enthroned as the method of casting the decision between the two, which resulted generally in a denial of the emotions. The 17th century belief in the rational control of the emotions had now become the habit of repressing the emotions. In this light, it is easy to understand why the less acceptable emotional impulses, such as sex and hostility, should have undergone particularly widespread repudiation. It is this psychological disunity which set the problem for the work of Sigmund Freud. His discoveries relating to unconscious forces and his techniques designed to assist the individual to find a new basis for psychological unity can be adequately understood only when seen against the background of compartmentalization of personality in the 19th century. 34. In view of this psychological disunity, it is not surprising that anxiety should have emerged as an unavoidable problem in the 19th century, and that in the middle of that period we should find Kierkegaard producing the most direct, and in some ways the most profound, study of anxiety to appear up to that point in history. The disunity itself was of course anxiety-creating, and the search for a new basis for unity of personality, as pursued by Kierkegaard and later by Freud, necessitated first of all confronting, and so far as possible solving, the problem of anxiety. This breakdown in the unity of thought and culture was keenly felt by a number of sensitive and prophetic thinkers of the 19th century, many of whom can be grouped under the term existentialists. The existentialist movement dates. 34 Freud often writes of his aim of making unconscious material conscious, and thus increasing the scope of reason. In his more theoretical writings, see Civilization and its Discontents and the Future of an Illusion, he has a concept of reason and science which is inherited directly from the 17th and 18th centuries. But in actual practice, his concept of reason, involving as it does a union of conscious experience with the vast store of unconscious tendencies within the individual, is a quite different thing from reason in traditional rationalism. 3. The meaning of anxiety. From the German philosopher F. W. J. Schelling's Berlin Lectures. In 1841, delivered before a distinguished audience including Kierkegaard, Engels, and Burckhardt. 35 in addition to Schell. Ling and Kierkegaard, existential thinking is represented on one wing by the philosophers of life, Nietzsche, Schopenhauer, and later Bergson, and its sociological wing is seen in Feuerbach. And Marx. 36 what all philosophers of existence oppose is the irrational system of thought and life developed by Western industrial society and its philosophical representatives. 37. Tillich characterizes the endeavors of these existential thinkers as the desperate struggle to find a new meaning of life in a reality from which men have been estranged, in a cultural situation in which two great traditions, the Christian and the humanistic, have lost their comprehensive character and their convincing power. 38 In their rejection of traditional rationalism, the existential thinkers insisted that reality can be proached and experienced only by the whole individual as a feeling and acting as well as a thinking organism. Kierkegaard felt that Hegel's system, which confuses abstract thought with reality, was nothing short of trickery. Kierkegaard and others in this line believed that passion cannot be divorced from think. Ng. Feuerbach wrote, "Only that which is the object of passion really is." 39 Said Nietzsche, "We think with Mr. Bodies." 35 Paul Tillich, Existential Philosophy, History of Ideas, 1944, 5:1, 44-70. Since Tillich's own thinking participates in the existentialist tradition, his descriptions of the movement have special cogency and will be quoted frequently in this section. 36 The relationship of this form of thought to American pragmatism, as presented by William James, will be clear. Modern European representatives of existentialism include M. Heidegger and K. Jaspers. We do not wish existentialism in this discussion to be identified with the present-day popular conception as presented, for example, in the philosophical writings of Sartre. This latter has been termed a parenthesis or deviation in the history of existentialism. Guido de Ruggiero, Existentialism, New York, 1948. 37 Existential Philosophy, Op. Cit., page 66. Tillich continues, "During the last 100 years, the implications of this system have become increasingly clear. A logical or naturalistic mechanism which seemed to destroy individual freedom, personal decision and organic community, and analytic rationalism which saps vital forces of life and transforms everything, including man himself, into an object of calculation and control." 36 Ibid, page 67. 89 Ibid, page 54. Philosophical Predecessors 31. Thus, these thinkers sought to overcome the traditional dichotomy between mind and body and the tendency to suppress the irrational aspects of experience. Pure objectivity is an illusion, Kierkegaard held, and even if it weren't, it would be undesirable. He emphasizes the word interest, which expresses the fact that we are so intimately involved in the objective world that we cannot be content to regard truth objectively, i.e., disinterestedly. 40 Kierkegaard reacted strongly against rigid definitions of such terms as self and truth. He felt they could be defined only dynamically, i.e., dialectically. Away from speculation, he cried, away from the system and back to reality. 41 He insisted that truth exists for the particular individual only as he himself produces it in action. 42 This sounds like a radical subjectivity which, on the surface it is, but it must be remembered that Kierkegaard and the others in this movement believed that this was the way to a genuine objectivity as opposed to the artificial objectivity of the rationalistic systems. As Tillich expresses it, these thinkers turned toward man's immediate experience, toward subjectivity, not as something opposed to objectivity, but as that living experience in which both objectivity and subjectivity are rooted. 43 It was the aim of these thinkers to overcome the compartmentalization of their culture by a new emphasis on the individual as a living, experiencing unity, i.e., the individual as an organism which thinks, feels, and wills at the same time. The existentialists are important in this study, not only because the dichotomy between psychology and philosophy is broken down in their thought, but also because now, for the first time in the modern period, anxiety comes directly into the foreground as a specific problem. We turn now to Søren Kierkegaard. He is regarded on the continent, according to Brock, as one of the most remarkable psychologists of all time, in depth, if not in breadth. 40 Walter Lowry, A Short Life of Kierkegaard, Princeton, N.J. 1944, page 172 Ibid. p. 116. 42 The Concept of Dread, Opsit, page 123. 48 Tillich, page 67. Also, they tried to discover the creative realm of being which is prior to and beyond the distinction between objectivity and subjectivity. 32 The Meaning of Anxiety, superior to Nietzsche, and in penetration comparable only to Dostoevsky. 44. The keystone idea in Kierkegaard's little book on anxiety. 45. Published in 1844, is the relation between anxiety and freedom. Kierkegaard held that anxiety is always to be understood as oriented toward freedom. 46 Freedom is the goal of personality development. Psychologically speaking, the good is freedom. 47. Kierkegaard defines freedom as possibility. This he views as the spiritual aspect of man. Indeed, it is not inaccurate to read possibility whenever Kierkegaard writes spirit, the distinctive characteristic of man, in contrast to the merely vegetative or the merely animal, lies in the range of man's possibility and in his capacity for self-awareness of his possibility. Kierkegaard sees man as the creature who is continually beckoned by possibility, who conceives of possibility, visualizes it, and by creative activity carries it into actuality. What the specific content of this possibility is, in psychological terms, we shall discuss below. In dealing with Kierkegaard's ideas of expansiveness and communicativeness, it suffices here to emphasize that this possibility is man's freedom. 44 Werner Brock, Contemporary German Philosophy, Cambridge, 1935, page 75. For an appreciation of Kierkegaard by a contemporary psychologist, C.O. H. Maurer, Anxiety in Learning Theory and Personality Dynamics, 1950. Maurer believes that it was necessary for Freud to produce his work before the insights of Kierkegaard could be widely understood. 45 Translated into English under the title The Concept of Dread, by Walter Lowry, and published at Princeton, N.J. in 1944. Lowry states that in English, we have no word which adequately translates angst. Preface to above edition, page 9. Hence, after much deliberation, Dr. Lowry and the other translators of Kierkegaard into English unanimously decided to use the term dread as a translation of Kierkegaard's angst. It is certainly to be agreed that the term anxiety in English often means eagerness. I am anxious to do something, or a mild form of worry, or has other connotations which do not at all do justice to the term angst. But the German Angst is the word which Freud, Stein, and others use for anxiety, and it is the common denominator for the term anxiety as used in this study. The question is whether the scientific psychological meaning of anxiety, in contrast to the literary meaning, is not very close, in fact much closer than the term dread, to what Kierkegaard meant by angst. Professor Tillich, who is familiar with both the psychological meaning of angst and Kierkegaard's works, believes this to be true. In any case, Professor Lowry has generously given the present author permission to render the term dread as anxiety in the quotations from his translations of Kierkegaard, in order to conform with the usage of terms in this book. 46. The Concept of Dread, page 138. 47. Ibid, page 99. Philosophical Predecessors 33. Now this capacity for freedom brings with it anxiety. Anchi. Eddy is the state of man, says Kierkegaard, when he confronts his freedom. Indeed, he describes anxiety as the possibility of freedom. Whenever possibility is visualized by an individual, anxiety is potentially present in the same experience. In everyday experiential terms, this may be illustrated by the observation that every person has the opportunity and need to move ahead in his development. The child learns to walk and moves on into school, and the adult moves into marriage or new jobs. Such possibilities, like roads ahead which cannot be known since one has not yet traversed and experienced them, involve anxiety. This is normal anxiety, and is not to be confused with neurotic anxiety, which will be considered below. Kierkegaard makes it clear that neurotic anxiety is a more constrictive and uncreative form of anxiety which results from the individual's failure to move ahead in situations of normal anxiety. 48. There is anxiety in any actualizing of possibility. To Kierkegaard, the more possibility, creativity, an individual has, the more potential anxiety he has at the same time. Possibility, I can, passes over into actuality, but the intermediate determinant is anxiety. 49. Viewing anxiety developmentally, Kierkegaard begins with the original state of the child. This he terms the state of innocence, in which the child is in immediate unity with his natural condition, his environment. The child has possibility. This entails anxiety, but it is anxiety without specific content. In this original state, anxiety is a seeking after adventure. 48. For the realization of selfhood, one must always move ahead. So it is too that, in the eyes of the world, it is dangerous to venture. And why? Because one may lose. But not to venture is shrewd. And yet, by not venturing, it is so dreadfully easy to lose that which it would be difficult to lose in even the most some venture, and in any case never so easily, so completely as if it were nothing. Oneself. For if I have ventured amiss, very well, then life helps me by its punishment. But if I have not ventured at all, who then helps me? And, moreover, if by not venturing at all in the highest sense, and to venture in the highest sense is precisely to become conscious of oneself, I have gained all earthly advantages. And lose myself, what of that? Kierkegaard, Sickness unto Death, trans. Walter Lowry, Princeton, N. J. 1941, page 52. Italics mine. 49. The Concept of Dread, page 44. The full quotation is, possibility means I can. In a logical system, it is convenient enough to say that possibility passes over into actuality. In reality, it is not so easy, and an intermediate determinant is necessary. This intermediate determinant is anxiety. 34. The meaning of anxiety. Thirst for the prodigious, the mysterious. 50. The child moves ahead, actualizing his possibilities. But in the state of innocence, he is not self-consciously aware that the possibility of growth, for example, also involves possibility of crises, of clashes with and defiance of parents. In the state of innocence, individuation is a potentiality which has not yet become self-conscious, and the anxiety connected with it is sheer possibility, i.e., without specific content. Then, in human development comes self-awareness. Kierkegaard cites the story of Adam as a presentation in myth form of this phenomenon. Disposing immediately of the deteriorated view of this myth as a historical event, he insists that the myth represents as outward that which occurred inwardly. 51. He interprets it as a portrayal of the individual's inner awakening into self-consciousness. At some point in development there occurs the knowledge of good and evil, as the myth puts it. Then conscious choice enters the picture of possibility. There is a heightened sense both of the portentous nature of possibility and of the responsibility that goes with it. For now, the possibility of conflict and crises confronts the individual. Possibility is negative as well as positive. Developmentally, the child now moves toward individuation, and the road over which he moves is not one of immediate harmony with environment or specifically with parents, but a road which continually skirts the edges of defiance of this environment. And indeed, in many cases, the road must move directly through actual experiences of defiance of, and conflict with, parents. Individuation, becoming a self, is gained at the price of confronting the anxiety inherent in taking a stand against as well as with one's environment. Describing the moment of this heightened awareness of the possibility of freedom, Kierkegaard speaks of the alarming possibility of being able. 52. So Ibid. Page 38. 51 Ibid. Page 92. In this sense, the myth of Adam is reenacted by every human being somewhere between the ages of 1 and 3. 52 Ibid. Page 40. Cf. From's description in Escape from Freedom, New York, 1941. Page 29. Of the threat of isolation and powerlessness and the consequent potential anxiety which may arise at this point in the child's development, discussed on pages 170 ff below. Philosophical Predecessors 35. It may be helpful to point out here that Kierkegaard's central problem when he writes psychologically is how a person can will to be himself. To will to be himself is man's true vocation. Kierkegaard holds that one cannot define specifically this self one is to be, for the self is freedom. But at considerable length he points out how people try to avoid willing to be themselves, by avoiding consciousness of the self, by willing to be someone else or simply a conventional self, or by willing to be oneself defiantly, which is a form of tragic, stoic despair and therefore doomed to fall short of full selfhood. His word, will, is not to be confused with 19th-century voluntarism, which consists chiefly of repression of unacceptable elements within the self. Rather, this willing is a creative decisiveness, based centrally on expanding self-awareness. Generally speaking, consciousness, i.e. consciousness of self, is the decisive criterion of the self. He writes, the more consciousness, the more self. 53. This is not a foreign language to anyone conversant with modern psychotherapy, in which the basic aim is to enlarge self-awareness by means of clarifying inner self-defeat ing conflicts which have existed because the individual has been forced to block self-awareness at various points. 54. It is clear in psychotherapy that these blockages in self-awareness have occurred because the individual has been unable to move through accumulations of anxiety at various points in his growth. Kierkegaard makes it clear that selfhood depends upon the individual's capacity to confront anxiety and move ahead despite it. Freedom, to Kierkegaard, is not a simple accretion, occurring as spontaneously as the plant grows toward the sun when the rocks that block it are removed, as the problem of freedom is sometimes oversimplified in deteriorated forms of psychotherapy. Freedom, rather, depends on how one relates oneself to oneself. At every moment in existence. This means in present day. 53 Sickness unto death. Opposite, or it should be clear that Kierkegaard therapy is not speaking of what is sometimes called unhealthy introspection. Such introspection arises not from too much self-awareness, which is a contradiction in terms in Kierkegaard's view, but rather from conditions of blocked self-awareness. 36 The meaning of anxiety. Terms that freedom depends on how responsibly and autonomously one relates to oneself. When Kierkegaard speaks of the awakening of self-awareness following the state of innocence of the child, one is tempted to compare this with the data of contemporary psychology. 55 It is obviously parallel to what is now meant in some psychological quarters by the emergence of the ego. This occurs generally somewhere between the ages of 1 and 3. We can observe that in babies this self-awareness does not exist, whereas it is discernible in the child of 4 or 5. So far as Kierkegaard's own view goes, he believed this change is a qualitative leap, and cannot therefore be adequately described by scientific methods. Kierkegaard's aim is to describe phenomenologically the human situation of an adult, for example, which he finds as a state of conflict, self-awareness, set against a backdrop of innocence. 56 As a consequence of this leap into self-awareness, anxiety becomes reflective, that is, has more content. Anxiety in the later individual is more reflective as a consequence of the participation of the individual in the history of the race. 57 Self-awareness makes possible not only self-directed individual development, but also self-conscious historical development. Just as the individual now sees himself as not merely at the mercy of his environment and his natural condition, but as possessing the capacities of choice and independence, so he sees himself likewise as something more than an automaton, swallowed up in a meaningless historical development. Through self-awareness man can mold and to an extent transform his present historical development. This does not annul the determining influences of one's historical environment. Every individual begins in a historical nexus, Kierkegaard writes, and the consequences of natural law are still as valid as ever. 58. 55 The difficulty in comparing ideas such as Kierkegaard's to parallel concepts in contemporary psychology is that the equivalence is never entirely complete. For example, his idea of the self is only partially contained in the psychological term ego, which is its nearest equivalent. 56 In philosophical terms, this is, of course, the problem of man's essence, as over against his existence. 57 The concept of dread. Opposite, page 47. F greater than 8 ibid.j page 65. Philosophical predecessors 37. But what is of crucial significance is how a man relates himself to his historical nexus. 59. Anxiety involves inner conflict. This is another consequence of self-awareness. Anxiety is afraid, says Kierkegaard. Yet it maintains a sly intercourse with its object, cannot look away from it, indeed will not. 60 And again, anxiety is a desire for what one dreads, a sympathetic antipathy. Anxiety is an alien power which lays hold of an individual, and yet one cannot tear oneself away, nor has a will to do so, for one fears but what? One fears one desires. Anxiety then makes the individual impotent. 61 This inner conflict which characterizes anxiety is familiar in modern clinical psychology. It has been described specifically by Freud, Steckel, Horney, and others. Ample illustrations of it can be cited from clinical data, especially in its exaggerated form in neurosis. A patient has sexual or aggressive desires, yet he fears these very desires or the consequences of them, and a persistent inner conflict is engendered. Every person who has been seriously ill physically knows that he has severe anxiety lest he not get well, yet he flirts with the prospect of not getting well. He is sympathetic, in Kierkegaard's words, toward the prospect that he hates and fears most. This seems to be a phenomenon much more profound than the mere desire for the secondary gain of illness, be it emotional or physical. Possibly Freud was struggling with this phenomenon when he postulated the much-questioned formulation of the death instinct as in conflict with the life instinct. It would seem that Otto Rank comes closer to Kierkegaard and at the same time avoids the less acceptable elements in Freud's postulation in his concept of the conflict between the life will and the 59. Kierkegaard's argument up to this point may be summarized as follows. In the state of innocence, there is no separation of the individual from his environment, and anxiety is ambiguous. In the state of self-awareness, there is this possibility of separation as an individual. Anxiety is reflective, and the individual can through self-awareness direct his own development as well as participate in the history of the race. 60. The concept of dread, page 92.